Okay, good day to you. My name is Professor Hal Sosabowski. I'm the great-grandson of General Stanislaw and the grandson of Dr. Major Sosabowski, and it's my pleasure to be presenting to you today the PowerPoint slides concerning my grandfather and my great-grandfather. And what we'll be doing is we'll be talking about their contribution to Polish military history in terms of the formation of the first Polish Independent Parachute Brigade, but also the contribution of my grandfather to the Polish underground, what happened to them during the war and what happened to them after the war. These are my antecedents. I'm a professor at the University of Brighton in England. And I wasn't a soldier, I never have been, but for a time I was a police officer, so I have some uniform service. Before I give the lecture, I need to acknowledge the input of a Polish soldier, Dariusz Krakowiak. I think 12 or 13 years ago we started talking about doing such a lecture, and he came to the UK and we put some material together. I've developed it since then, of course, but I need to make sure that he knows that his contribution has been correctly acknowledged. This is my family tree for the last 4 generations. The Major was the son of the General. The Major had 2 twin sons, Maciej and Stan. Stan died, I think, about 7 years ago. My father's still alive in England, and there are now 2 of us, my cousin Dr. General Stanislaw and myself, who talk about our family history. This is an important photograph for us because this is the 4 generations photo. As you can probably see, on our left-hand side in the blue suit is Dr. Major Sosabowski, hero of the Warsaw Uprising. In the brown suit is General Sosabowski just before he died. In the black suit is my father, Maciej Sosabowski, and also in a brown suit is Stasinek Sosabowski. Oh, and in the white suit, of course, is me. This is what we're going to be talking about today. The lecture is 4 parts with perhaps some questions and answers later on. The first part is literally the history of the brigade. How did the brigade happen? How did we get to this? How did the General put together a brigade from effectively war-torn refugees? We'll then confine our attention to what happened at Operation Market Garden, and we'll talk about the contribution of all the Allies and what happened then. We'll then focus our attention more closely at the Polish intervention in Operation Market Garden, and then an affectionate biography of my grandfather and my great-grandfather. We'll talk about the history of the brigade, and to do that we need to talk about the General. And the General was, he was a man even when he was a boy, because his father died when he was only 12, and he was in charge of his family unit. His mother allowed him to be the man of the house, and so whilst he was trying to educate himself, he was also trying to earn money for the running of the household, and he did this by tutoring other pupils in the school. He couldn't afford to buy textbooks, so during the breaks in the school day he would borrow the textbooks of other pupils and learn, and he would even walk to school slowly trying to read and catch up with the lessons, because in the evenings he was earning money by tutoring and giving lessons to other people. So very quickly he assumed a leadership role only in his family, and he helped his mother to move the house to the slightly cheaper house in Stanislaw. These pictures I can't tell you much about because they are historical. There's a young British writer called Michael Russell who's just written or is writing a history of the General, and hopefully we can tell you more about that when it's published. But he was a scholar, he liked to learn, and he was exceptionally intelligent, and in 1910 he got his matriculation and started looking towards joining some sort of uniform service. So he joined the early Scouts. He started contributing and leading as soon as he was able, and these are various pictures of the early Scouts where he presumably learned some of his leadership roles and engaged in the form of uniformed service. More pictures of the early scouting, which he enjoyed, and it was the only kind of pleasure he really got, because when he wasn't doing the scouting and he wasn't learning his school lessons, he was providing for his family. And then in 1939 he went into military service, having served in Austrian army, which we haven't got really time to focus on. He started leading in the Children of Warsaw Infantry Regiment. We'll show some pictures later on of him when he was a young soldier, but clearly there was a crisis happening with the Nazi invasion of Poland, and both the general and the major were key in repelling that in their different ways. There was much fighting in Warsaw, and he was leading the repelling of the German forces, and he and his son went different ways. His son stayed in Warsaw in order to help with the resistance. He felt his role was better served by removing himself and then forming some type of column which could go back and reclaim Warsaw. As that happened in 1940, the ship Abdopol sailed, and there were many Polish soldiers on that ship from the 4th Polish Infantry Division, and they were evacuated to United Kingdom, and it was felt that they would be put to use in order to fight the Germans. I don't know that anyone knew how they were going to do that at an early stage, but already my great-grandfather was thinking about how he could contribute in this regard. These are just pictures from the Abdopol of the soldiers, and they were moved to Scotland. Now, there were lots of Polish soldiers, some of them were well qualified, and initially General Maciek and General Paszkiewicz were given the choice of the soldiers to take, and only when they had selected their soldiers, the remainder were left with General Stanislaw. And so he was working with soldiers who may have not been particularly fit, but he made the best of it. So there were the Armour Brigade and the Military Brigade, and what was left was given to General Sosabowski. And they were called initially the Canadian Rifle Brigade, because it was thought that lots of Canadians would be joining them later on. This never came to happen, and the brigade was renamed a little bit later on. And the initial early task was to guard Scotland against potential enemy landing operations. And very quickly, they were effectively new people in the town, but the Scottish welcomed them. And when I unveiled recently the new monument to the brigade and General Stanislaw in Scotland, there were many veterans who stayed in Scotland after the war because they'd met their wives and they had families, and so Scottish-Polish relations are still very, very important. In 1940, the Rifle Brigade, the Canadian Rifle Brigade, was renamed the 4th Cadre Rifle Brigade, so it's obvious that Canadians weren't going to join, and Sosabowski had to find volunteers for underground country work, and a course was set up at Fort William to train the Cicho Ciemni, the silent and the unseen, to go to Warsaw. And at this point, I think, the idea of parachute started being taken quite seriously. Sosabowski realised that in order to defeat the enemy, you had to surprise the enemy. And if you came in with normal armour, then it's not a surprise, of course, but the parachute is the surprise. And what we'll see that the Gapa, the symbol of the Parachute Brigade, was encapsulating this notion of surprise, dropping in on the enemy, on the prey, and surprising them before they realised what was happening. And at this point, my great-grandfather started devising the parachute course at Ringway, and this was a period of innovation whereby Poles who were under-resourced, under-equipped, were making the best with what they had, and two pilots, Gebolis and Gorecki, they were engineers. They helped design and contributed to the first parachute tower, which we'll see a little bit later on. But this was all about enabling a parachutist to feel the effect of the parachute drop with a fully deployed parachute without having to go in the aeroplane. So the parachute course was being formulated, the parachute tower was being built, and as we will see, this was used not only by the Poles but by many of the Allies also. There's a nice picture of the General smiling. He didn't smile often, but there was one of those times when he was smiling. So there were some deployments of the brigade, and they were specifically asked to defend the peninsula around Fife. And as they were doing this, this was their day job, they were also training and parachuting and learning how to be soldiers, because of course parachuting is only the first step. You have to learn how to fight once you've parachuted. So paras not only have to be well-equipped soldiers and effective soldiers, they have to learn how to parachute in addition to this. These are just various pictures. I can't say much about them. This is Leuven in 1942, but already you can see that we are developing a fighting force, a brigade of trained soldiers, and developing an esprit de corps, a pride in themselves and what they're doing, but also every one of them wanted to hope that they could go back and liberate Warsaw. This shows what they called the monkey grove, and we'll talk more about this later as well. But because the Poles were so under-equipped, they had to build their own equipment for exercises, and so that's exactly what they did. They built things out of wood and scrap in order that they could train, and that they could train to be proper parachutists, even though they were completely under-deployed. Broadly, the Poles got what the British didn't want, so Browning would send them old materials and old equipments that weren't any use to anyone. And it was all about pride. So this is an early parade in Scotland, and you can see this general standing in his dress uniform on the left-hand side of the picture. And of course they had to learn how to be multi-skilled soldiers, so there was some input from Norwegian trainers, so they were taught how to ski, and this was just one aspect of their multifaceted training. Some Poles from the Tatry Mountains came and trained them on the mountains in Scotland, so they were parachutists who could fight, they could ski, they could climb the mountains, and later on we'll see that they could survive in the very harsh conditions. It showed them they had to make their own little buildings, they had to hunt, catch the rabbits, catch the birds, catch the fish, and they had to survive when there was no resupply. And the two soldiers on the right hand side, I think one of them was killed in Operation Market Garden, and one of them was killed in an air accident later on. And so Largo House. Now Largo House still exists. I went there a few years ago. It's sadly not being looked after. But once again, the parachute course was all about building equipments and building models for parachute activities that would train the soldiers, because they didn't have any aeroplanes. So they had some parachutes, they had some wood, and they just made the best of what they had. And this is the Polish engineer-designed parachute tower, the first of its kind, which allowed the parachutist to land in a fully deployed parachute from maybe 60 meters without oscillation, and it was a very realistic way of learning the experience of parachuting without actually having to parachute. I like this picture very much because you can see the look of pride on these soldiers' faces. This is the front of Largo House and the Polish flag and the British Union flag behind them. But the look on their faces, they're proud to be Polish soldiers. They're proud to think that they will be parachuting back into Warsaw to free Warsaw from the oppression. There were various inspections by notable military dignitaries. I don't know who that is, but it was one of many inspections and visits that the Poles were having because they were being recognised as being a formidable force and a particularly high value asset for liberation of Europe in general, but Poland in particular. And you can see the boys there are training. I think there's an officer in the middle, but they're looking proud to be in their uniforms. And that's a lovely picture of the general smiling. And I don't know if he knows he's being photographed, but look at his face. This is a genuine smile. It's not a plastic smile. He's proud of his people, and these are French soldiers, I think, but he's proud of the fact that the Poles were training other Europeans. The European soldiers were coming to be trained in parachute skills by the Polish, so these free French officers were being trained. I think they're passing out and having their inspection, and the look on the general's face tells us all we need to know. For inspection of the free French, I think these are undoubtedly officers, and the general is passing them presumably their parachute wings. More pictures of improvisation, just literally hanging the rope from the tree and falling to the ground to emulate the landing of the parachute. And I don't know, this is a nice picture. We've managed to name this Polish parachutist Corporal Jankowski, once again looking proud and happy to be serving and learning to liberate Warsaw. And that's the view from the top of the parachute tower, and I'm not sure that I would be wanting to jump from that when you look down. The parachute course at Ringway was actually quite complicated. It was complicated and it was simple. It was simple because they made equipment out of pieces of wood. So on the left-hand picture you can see here, they've just made like a table with a hole in it to emulate the parachute bay in the Whitley bomber, which is what they were given to train with. And at this point they were learning how to drop through it without hitting their head on the side of the bay. And you weren't really a proper parachutist unless you'd hit your jaw on this wooden circle. That was called ringing the bell. When you rung the bell, you were clearly a qualified parachutist. And once again, the two engineers, the two parachute engineers, were instructing and innovating and making sure that all their knowledge was used to the good of the brigade. Lots of innovations. The next slide, I think, tells us about the Polish method for landing. But these are the numbers: 244 French, 168 Norwegians, 4 Dutch, and 69 British paras. So the British paras had got, the airborne, but still they were sending paras to the Poles to be trained. Wing Commander Maurice Newnham, he was, I think, an RAF soldier, receiving his wings. And the jump methods that were researched was the new Polish method, and they decided that if you manipulate your shroud lines, you change your speed and your course, and this was a completely different way of doing it compared to the British doctrine, which is landing facing the drift, and you had to just take your chances, or the German method with a single riser where you land on all fours. The Polish method was different, and you pull the risers individually and you land with your back to the drift, ready to fight, often on your feet. You can see on the left hand side the emulation from the parachute balloon. The parachute balloon was the next stage in the parachute training. It allowed a parachute jump from the height with 0 slipstream, enabling easier first jumps, because of course aeroplane had the slipstream. Again, more pictures. On the top right-hand side, you can see the Whitley bomber. The Whitley bomber was famously slow, and so it wasn't an ideal plane to be parachuting out of, because the Germans would see the Whitley bomber coming, they could stop, they could have a glass of schnapps, light their cigarette, have something to eat, and only then turn on their anti-aircraft. So the Whitley bomber was given to the Poles because the British didn't want them. This is the adjutant, Jerzy Dirda, who supported the general, and now we have some video footage from that time.
Niemcy hitlerowskie się załamały, to wtedy generał Sikorski mógłby się dostać w ciągu 6 godzin do Polski. Ale zanim jakieś wojsko jego, jakaś dywizja przeszła do kraju, to wtedy trwałoby to na pewno 6 tygodni.
Zapadło moje postanowienie. Pójdziemy do kraju jako kadra pierwszej polskiej brygady spadochronowej. Sprzymierzeni dostarczą nam broni i zaopatrzenia materiałowego. Brygada i kraj najkrótszą drogą to nasze przeznaczenie. Jakim materiałem ludzkim rozporządzałem? 80% oficerów wszystkich rodzajów broni i służb. Rozpiętość wieku od lat 20 do 50, stopnie od podporucznika do pułkownika. A wytrzymałość fizyczna? Trudno było wymagać na przykład od pułkowników, którzy byli już po 40, aby ich stan fizyczny odpowiadał warunkom skoku ze spadochronem. Oczywiście mieliśmy sporą ilość wysportowanych oficerów i podchorążych. Trzeba było zorganizować w brygadzie specjalny ośrodek wstępnego szkolenia spadochronowego, który nosił później nazwę Małpiego Gaju. Zainstalowany sprzęt sportowy, jak równoważnie kozły, liny do wspinania oraz cały zespół rozmaitych przyrządów i urządzeń do pokonywania przeszkód w terenie skonstruowaliśmy sami. Na drzewach w parku porozwieszano różne rodzaje trapezów. W stajni nasi oficerowie saperzy wykonali w suficie otwór imitujący dziurę wyskokową z samolotu. Z tego otworu na rozsypany na podłodze piasek trzeba było skakać z pozycji siedzącej, tak jak przepisowo skacze się z samolotu. Później powstała polska sekcja wyszkolenia spadochronowego w brytyjskim ośrodku w Ringway, przez którą w latach 1941-45 przeszło ponad 5000 żołnierzy polskich i alianckich. We wrześniu 1941 roku odbyły się ćwiczenia. Spadochroniarze lądowali bez wypadku i wykonali swoje zadanie bojowe. Zarówno generał Sikorski, jak i jego otoczenie polskie i brytyjskie byli zadowoleni z wyników ćwiczeń. Generał wręczył osobiście zebranym skoczkom znaki spadochronowe.
So there we saw the Whitley bomber, very interesting, and we also saw the parachute tower, how that allowed the parachutists to have a realistic jump from a small height. So it was all about the training. The general said the boredom is the enemy of the soldier. We need to keep them training. But interestingly, I think that's the general there. I think he was taking part in the training, and he would never ask his soldiers to do something that he wouldn't do. I also noticed that a lot of those soldiers were very thin. I don't think they were given very much to eat, and they had to make do with what they had. And so it continued, training continued. General Sikorsky visited 1941. The soldiers continued to learn how to be soldiers and how to be parachutists and take pride in what they did. And slowly they came to be a fighting force. This is photographs from Kincraig, more photographs from Kincraig. Always the general in attendance. He was never far from his boys, always proud of his boys. And here we have General Sikorsky investing the first Polish Parachute Brigade, giving it its new name for the first time, and giving an assurance that it would be liberating Warsaw sooner rather than later. We have another video now of activities. At this point, the concept of the Gapa was being formulated, the eagle dropping from the sky to land on the enemy before the enemy realizes what's happening. Some more video footage now follows.
Którego polska brygada spadochronowa jest w wyłącznej dyspozycji polskiego naczelnego wodza z przeznaczeniem do operacji w Polsce. Jednak wobec zmienionej sytuacji i konieczności zmobilizowania wszystkich sił będących w dyspozycji dla operacji na Zachodzie oraz faktu, że polska brygada spadochronowa ma bojowo doskonałych żołnierzy, pisał generał Grasset, szef sztabu imperialnego, Ma nadzieję, że brygada zostanie oddana do dyspozycji Naczelnego Dowództwa Wojsk Sprzymierzonych dla operacji na froncie zachodnim. Walka o krajowe przeznaczenie brygady została zakończona naszą przegraną. Do kraju nie polecieliśmy. Nie miałem wątpliwości, że nastaną dla mnie dni trudne. Moje stosunki z generałem Browningiem, który był teraz moim bezpośrednim przełożonym, popsuły się wyraźnie, gdyż uważał on, że moja osoba była głównym źródłem trudności w przekazaniu brygady pod dowództwo brytyjskie. Właśnie wtedy, gdy rozgrywała się zacięta walka z generałem Browningiem co do terminu gotowości bojowej brygady, w kraju nastąpiły wypadki, których konsekwencją była depesza dowódcy Armii Krajowej generała Bora do naczelnego wodza z dnia 25 lipca 1944 roku tej treści. Jesteśmy gotowi w każdej chwili do walki o Warszawę. Przybycie do tej walki brygady spadochronowej będzie miało olbrzymie znaczenie polityczne i taktyczne. Moment rozpoczęcia walki zamelduję. W chwili, gdy nadeszła depesza, byliśmy już od 6 tygodni pod dowództwem brytyjskim w gotowości do walk na kontynencie.
So now they're looking like soldiers. This is a fighting force, and there are notable military celebrities coming to visit them because they're being taken very, very seriously. And Sergeant Valentinovich had designed the Gappa. On the left-hand side is the standard Gappa. On the right-hand side is the Home Army version of the Gappa with the laurel wreath and the symbol of the Home Army. And so once again, General Sosabowski, he was Colonel Sosabowski then, but for me he'll always be General Sosabowski. He pointed out that boredom is the biggest enemy of the soldier. Keep the boys busy and keep the morale high. So he kept on going with the exercises and the pride in the brigade. And as time went on, there were new recruits to the brigade from Russia via Persia, Palestine and Egypt. And at this time, of course, in the Khitan forest, there was a terrible massacre of Polish officers and soldiers by the Russians. And at this point now, the brigade was starting to form into regiments and companies and battalions. And 2 parachute battalions were formed. In 1943, a 3rd battalion was formed, and there were specialisms happening: signals, artillery, medics. But all along, it was all about the liberation of Poland. Once again, General Anders visits in 1942 to congratulate the soldiers. We have some artillery here in 1942 preparing for action, and you can just see it, in such a short time they went from being a collection of boys and men, ex-soldiers, to being effectively almost an army in waiting. More parades. This is Leuven in 1943, where I think about 5 years ago I unveiled the new memorial to the brigade and to my great-grandfather. And at some point there was exercises with the 1st Airborne, so the Poles and the British started working together. There's an unusual picture top left of the general wearing his glasses. He didn't like wearing the glasses, and it's him with Jerzy Dirda, his adjutant. In 1943, General Browning presents the new brigade colours. We'll talk more about the colours a little bit later on. And he toured. I don't know what to tell you about General Browning. He wasn't a friend of the Poles. It's as simple as that. And as we'll find out, of all the betrayals of the Polish, his was one of the worst. I'll tell you more about that a little bit later on. But at this point, he was the only source of supply and resources to the Poles, and General Sosabowski was doing his best to nurture this relationship and be grateful for whatever they were given. But that picture tells us everything we need to know. Look at the distance between them and look at the looks on their faces. I think that they may have respected each other, but I don't think they liked each other. These were the uniforms of both the officers and the soldiers. It's a handsome dress uniform the officers are wearing there, and they look like genuine soldiers. In 1944, 3 parachute battalions, a field artillery battalion, signals, engineers, medical and supply corps, just over 2,000 soldiers. So now this is really a brigade ready to fight and wanting to fight in Warsaw. And there were some characters. Richard Tice was an American, and he heard about the brigade and he enlisted. He said, I just want to join you because I like what you're doing. And he was promoted to second lieutenant. That's his commission. He was called the Cowboy because he was an American. There's some disagreement about whether the photograph on the right is him or it's not. Let's leave that where it is. It doesn't really matter. The fact is he was so inspired by the Polish and what they were doing that he joined even though he wasn't Polish. These were some visitors: Attlee, Montgomery and Browning. In 1943, the death of General Stanislaw, so the brigade paraded for his remembrance. And in 1940, also my great-grandfather decorated with the Gold Cross of Merit with the swords, and by 1943 they were ready to go. They were proper parachutists. They had equipment now, including the Wellbike motor scooter. The idea was, even if you had to parachute on a drop zone far from your target, you could get on the Wellbike motor scooter, which dropped with you, and scooter into fighting. 1944 in Cupar, a standard was presented to the brigade. Colonel Sosabowski promoted to Major General, and the standard was made from the robes of Cardinal Doniewski by the women in Warsaw and brought to Great Britain by 3 Cichociemni. So it was a really important thing that Captain Kalinkiewicz brought to the brigade, because it was made from the robe of the Cardinal and made by the women of Warsaw. In 1944 in Cupar, the President attended, and more parades and so forth, a visit to Fort Benning, and mobilisation in 1944 to Stamford, where there was operational training in preparation for being dropped in for active service. Again, the soldiers thought they were going to liberate Warsaw. This is the organisation of the brigade, and you can see this is a proper brigade now. It's not just a load of soldiers together. It's been given proper taxonomy, and they are a proper fighting force. They went to Stamford, where they were subordinated to the 1st Airborne for the last exercises before what they anticipated to be the drop into Warsaw. And during that time, 2 Dakotas crashed, and 26 Poles and 8 Americans were deceased as a result of that. That was the Tin War tragedy. The brigade then went into Market Garden on day 5. We'll look at that a little bit later on. We'll just continue the story. After the war, they were subordinated and assimilated into the Rhine Army, and in 1947 the brigade was disbanded. That brings us to the point where we remember the brigade. We'll be looking at them again a bit later on, but that's end of part 1. In part 2, we'll look at Operation Market Garden as it happened and draw some conclusions. I'll look forward to seeing you then, but for now we'll take a very short break.